Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another video lecture for Psych 370. In this one, I'm going to be going over the different measures of learning that are described on pages 36 through 42 of your textbook. So, as you know, learning involves changes in behavior. We've defined learning as changes in behavior that occur due to experience, but there are many different ways in which behavior can change. And so, there are also many different ways that a learning researcher might want to measure those changes. First of all, one way to measure learning is to measure the number of errors that a person or an animal commits as they perform a task. So, for example, if you're just learning to type on a keyboard, then one way that we could track your progression as a typist would be to count the number of typographical errors that you make as you type. And so we could say that the fewer typos you have, the better you've learned that skill. Or here's another example. When I first started driving a car with a manual transmission, so a stick shift, I often made the embarrassing mistake of killing it by letting off of the clutch too quickly or stepping on the gas too slowly. So the car would stall, almost invariably, it seemed like, at a busy intersection with a bunch of cars behind me, and I'd have to turn the key in the ignition again and start the car back up again. And so each one of those occurrences could be called an error. And the fact that I now kill it less often when I drive a stick shift is one way to quantify how well I've learned to perform that behavior. So, one way to measure learning is to measure errors, and another way is to measure the speed with which the person or the animal performs the behavior. And so, guys, when we talk about speed as a measure of learning, we're talking about how long it takes the person or the animal to complete a certain behavior. So, for example, learning researchers are often interested in how much time it takes an animal, like a rat, to get from the start of a maze to the end of it. Now, they can measure errors too, of course. They could measure something like the number of wrong turns that the rat makes while it navigates the maze, but a decrease in the time required to reach the end of the maze would also demonstrate learning as an increase in speed. Or here's another example. Guys, I've played tennis most of my life, okay? And if you play tennis for long enough, you eventually get to where you start breaking strings. So just through normal play, those strings in your racket will eventually break. And so, since it can get expensive to pay someone to restring your racket every time that happens, I've learned to string my own rackets. But when I was first learning to restring a tennis racket back in high school, it took me over an hour to complete that task. Now that I've had over 20 years of experience with that task, I can string a racket in about half that time. So I perform the behavior more quickly, which is one way to quantify how well I've learned that skill. Now, of course, I make fewer mistakes too, so my reduction in errors is also evidence of my learning. But obviously, when we get better at something, we often learn to do it faster with greater speed. However, as the textbook points out, reductions in speed can also indicate that learning has taken place. So remember, learning is defined as a change in behavior, so decreased speed could also fit that definition. The book uses the example of children learning to eat more slowly at the dinner table, which is part of good table manners. And another example of learning as a reduction in speed would be a teacher learning to take more time to explain a concept in class so that students get a clearer and more complete understanding of it. Okay, so the speed of a behavior often changes as a result of learning, and the rate at which a behavior is performed is another way to measure learned changes in behavior. Now, guys, rate and speed are related to each other, but they're not the same thing. Okay, so remember, when we measure speed, we're measuring how much time the person or animal takes to perform one behavior, like running a maze or stringing a tennis racket, from start to finish. That's speed. With rate, we're looking at how many times the animal performs the behavior per unit of time, like per minute, per hour, per day, or whatever. So, for example, in learning research, people often measure the rate at which an animal, like a rat, performs some behavior in a Skinner box, right? So, how many times per minute does this rat press this bar? Or how many times per minute does this pigeon peck this disc on the wall? At what rate does the animal perform that behavior? So the animal could demonstrate that it's learned something by either increasing the rate of the behavior, like the rat could go from pressing the bar 10 times per minute to pressing it 50 times per minute, or it could decrease the rate. It could perform that behavior less frequently. So, for example, if pressing the bar got punished somehow, then we'd see that rat decrease the rate at which it presses the bar, maybe to the point that it doesn't press it at all. So, anyway, we can also measure the rate of a behavior. We can measure how frequently it occurs per unit of time. And we can also measure how long it takes for the behavior to occur. We can measure the amount of time that passes before the animal performs the behavior. And guys, when we do that, we're measuring what we call the latency of the behavior. That's known as latency. And so that's another measure of learning. So, how long does it take? How much time passes before the person or the animal initiates the behavior? That's what latency is all about. So, for example, if you're a sprinter in track, then you probably spend a lot of time practicing your start, right? Because that's where the race could be won or lost. You want to get out of those starting blocks as soon as possible, right after you hear the gun that signals the beginning of the race. And so you want as little latency as possible, right? You want to minimize the amount of time that passes between when that gun goes off and when you start running. So as you train, you will learn probably to decrease that latency. But in other cases, learning can involve an increase in latency. So, for example, when I turn on the shower in my bathroom at home, the water is cold at first. It takes a little while for it to warm up to a temperature that I would find comfortable. And so I've learned to wait a few extra seconds after I turn on the water before I get in. And so that delay that I've learned to impose between turning on the shower and getting into the shower, that represents an increase in latency. So, guys, a lot of these measures of learning are pretty straightforward, but there are a few more that maybe aren't as intuitive, like this one: intensity. And, guys, when we talk about the intensity of a behavior, we're talking about the force of it, okay, or the magnitude of it, the strength of it. So, for example, as a dog learns to associate the sound of a bell with food, as you repeatedly ring the bell and then present the food over and over again, that dog will eventually learn to salivate more and more to the bell, right? So at first, the bell might only elicit a drop or two of salivation, but later, as the dog learns that the bell means that food is on the way, it's going to salivate much more. So the bell will come to elicit more saliva from the dog. And so we'd say that that response, that conditioned response of salivation to the bell, it has increased in intensity. It's increased in strength. It has increased in magnitude. So learning can involve an increase in intensity, but again, it can also involve a decrease. So, for example, my 3-year-old daughter has learned that it's much nicer to pet our dog softly and slowly than it is to pet her as hard and as fast as you can. And so she's learned to decrease the intensity of that behavior. That reduction in intensity is indicative of her learning the better way to pet her dog. So that's what intensity is all about. Again, with intensity, we're talking about the strength or the magnitude of the behavior. But next, sometimes you're more interested in measuring learning as a change in what we call the topography of a behavior. And guys, that's basically all about what the behavior looks like. It's the actual physical form that the behavior takes. So, for example, if you had a rat pressing a bar in a Skinner box, then you probably would record the rate at which it presses the bar. But either instead of or in addition to those measurements, you could also observe and record how the rat presses the bar. So, for example, does it use its left paw? Does it use its right paw? Does it use both paws? So, you could describe the topography of that behavior. And the topography of a behavior often does change as a result of learning. So, for example, when my son was first learning to play baseball, I was mostly interested in seeing that learning unfold as a change in topography. So, I wanted to see him making a nice level swing, regardless of whether he hit the ball or not. I wanted to see him stepping with the proper foot when he threw the ball, regardless of how far or in what direction he threw it. So, I was interested in the topography of his behavior. And as we learn things, we often do come to perform them a little differently. There's often a change in the form that the behavior takes, a change in what the behavior looks like. And again, we refer to those changes as changes in topography. And then finally, guys, one last measure of learning that the textbook discusses is called fluency, which is defined as the number of correct responses per unit of time. So fluency is similar to the rate measure that I talked about earlier, but it's a little different because it also takes accuracy into account. It takes errors into account. So, for example, if I want to know how well you've learned to type, then I might measure your typing skill as something like words per minute or keystrokes per minute. But that by itself doesn't necessarily tell me how good of a typist you are, because it could be that a lot of the keystrokes that you're making are incorrect, right? And so what I might do instead is break that down to one measure of correct keystrokes per minute and another of incorrect keystrokes per minute. And I'd say that your fluency as a typist is improving if you are increasing your rate of correct responses and decreasing your rate of incorrect ones. Okay, so in total, the chapter describes 7 different ways in which learning can be measured. We can look at errors, rate, speed, latency, intensity, topography, and fluency. Again, you can read about those in the textbook on pages 36 through 42. And if you have any questions about them, then please let me know. Take care.